Welcome back to the Warhorse podcast, pilot episode number 5. Tonight I am once again surrounded by my weapons. Tonight I've got my dogs with me, and the storm just blew through. So hopefully we'll get a long enough break to get some halfway decent audio. Tonight I need to tie together everything that we've discussed in the previous 4 episodes. If you recall, we wound up last week with a kind of cliffhanger where we're looking at a situation where, we have these tools, breathwork and deathwork, and we have these potentials, one of which was brought into a sharper focus this week. And that being that perhaps the reason that we don't like to go to funerals is because not only they, suggest and indicate some level of sadness and sorrow, disappointment, just general dog shit period of time, but also I think there's a sense that they're just hollow. Occasionally you get this kind of hedonistic, counter response, which I can't say I disapprove of, where someone will fund their own funeral and say, I want to throw a kegger, or I want you out like the Irish wake, There's something to that. However, for the most part, I think that, those are kind of rare. Not sure they deliver on much other than kind of collectivizing the big avoidance pattern for the time being until the reality creeps in. And as human beings, we're certainly deprived of, this sense of meaning, or, a closure is not, I don't think you're going to get that in any ritual, or you can button it up for the time being for yourself, but it's not going to speak to the fact that, like Heidegger suggests, you yourself are a being with a capital B unto death. And in terms of death as a portal, we have the possibility that that's just entirely a metaphor, or a sort of hopeful, back to that Vanderklay's like optimistically spiritual and just totally vague. He has a better way of describing it, but it's essentially a sort of Protestant American optimistic spirituality, which meshes on the one side real nicely with the New Age, which is, cursory examination pretty much shows this is, essentially a form of Satanism. Not that we need to get into that, just set that out there and stand by it. The second possibility that we have is that there are actual spaces, situated on the earth, whether it's like the giant mounds that were found in America, or Bermuda Triangle, or some, cavern in Antarctica that's buried under ice and snow that we'll never know about. Some space, or the I forget the name of it right now. The particle collider, a hadron. Was that what that was trying to do? Was open up a literal portal? So either way, that's a second possibility. You get the idea. There's some space, some place in the dark wood, or way out in the desert, or hell, maybe in like in movies, sometimes it'll be tucked into some false alleyway in in a city, which would have been a good segue over into David Lynch, but I'll have to set it aside. Because there's a third possibility, which is that there are portals. They don't necessarily exist as such in some specific physical place, like they generally are like this in movies. And it's also not just simply a sort of empty metaphor for a hopeful condition where, perhaps when we die, perhaps some wonderkind will wander in and explain to us some type of. It's just essentially kind of another story, It's as disappointing as the standard American funeral in its way. But you have this third possibility, which would be what? Which would basically be something on the interior that would be, one listener, a subscriber, has brought up the conversation at the end of King of Dogs about the frog's egg, which is how I refer to it as well. And essentially what you have there is a discussion about this phenomena of structures being mirrored at all different types of levels. Maybe the most common one is just looking at fractals. When you watch slow footage of electricity, and then you compare it to certain plant structures or all kinds of things. Maybe the best example that I know of is I think it's the cuttlefish, who spends several days, tiny little guy, at the bottom of the ocean, using his tail and kind of his underbelly for days to swoop out this, essentially makes a mandala. And this is, as far as scientists know, they chalk it up to his potential mate sees in him what? And he's an artist. He's a guy who can keep it together for 4 straight days, so that's an indication of fitness. This is another example of where this fucking theory just, it might be true. I'm not saying I know or I don't know. I'm pretty sure it's not true. And I do admit it has an enormous amount of explanatory power. But it's also, when you scratch the surface like that, you start to realize how much of it is just supposition and anthropomorphizing. And anyway, the cuttlefish at the bottom of the ocean, 4 solid days, scoops out. It looks to be about maybe 3 or 4 feet wide. It's dimensional. It has ridges and several levels of ridges, so that if you look at it, you can see the relief, and it's not particularly like stunning visual piece of art exactly. And maybe or maybe not, is the outcome that he attracts a mate. But when I see something like that, it brings to mind, I believe it's called psionics or cymatics. I'll have to put that in the notes. But this is essentially, a study of frequencies and the way these frequencies affect matter. Really cool videos you can see where guys will take these steel tabletops and disperse some just basic sand on them, and then take sort of like a drumstick or a piece of rubber, and in the way that you can make wine glasses sing, this guy will go around the edge of the table to create this frequency, and the sand will form into the same shape if he uses the same frequency. But if he uses another frequency, it'll form into another shape. And this is an example of cymatics. And so when I look at the cuttlefish, I have to wonder is he really doing this for the visual appeal of this female fish? Or is he does he have some other set of senses, that tuned him into something on the floor of the earth there that he knows? I mean, if we continue on with the mating idea, maybe this is the energetic spot where he and his girl are to get down and to, I guess, fish fertilize eggs. I'm not quite sure how these fish do it, but you see where I'm going. Was this more, is the survival of the fittest quality, or the attraction quality, if we start ditching evolution, which you can see I'm angling towards this, at least a radical, very, very radical redrawing of it. And maybe we'll have, opportunity in this talk to get into time. I kind of doubt it, but it's definitely a feature in my skepticism. So the fish, what if the fish has detected something else in this area? A different type of magnetic field, or a stronger magnetic field, or we talk about good vibes. Let's just use that. So he's detected, good vibes. And maybe the female fish doesn't have this. Or maybe she does, and something in his creation helps to amplify that. Well, going back to portals, if we as human beings in 2021 are as far gone, as much as diminished as many studies seem to indicate, and things as simple as just analyze a few of the letters home from the Civil War soldiers, guys who are like 16, 17, maybe 20 years old, composing prose that you presume they did it in one pass, because they don't have a lot of paper. They might have an evening. It might take them several hours to write the letter. There's motivation and other reasons for why, maybe a closer relationship with their own mortality being one. There's reasons why these letters, other than they're just smarter. But I think it is also that they're just smarter. Physically, there doesn't seem to be a lot of debate about this. We're far diminished from what we were. When more than 50% of the adult American population is not just overweight, but morbidly obese. Just fucking case closed. Case closed. Because we know that every system is related to every other system. We know that the gut biome is directly related to not only just your mental health, how good you are feeling and feel about yourself, but also your cognitive abilities. We know as well that your cognitive abilities are stunted or enhanced by, each of the other systems, which at this stage, going back to the frog's egg discussion, the inner is mirroring the outer, as above, so below. We are like physically manifesting this maxim of truth. And so my question to pull us out of the cliffhanger is, and I'm not closing the door on the possibility of just actual portals. That was kind of the point of the cuttlefish story. Remind me and I'll link that video. It's pretty spectacular. But what if in this diminished state of our being, not only have we lost more material types of attributes. A couple come to mind. There's the fact that within our inner ear, we have this tiny sack of crystals that is suspended in a liquid. And crystals, mind you, which is one of these things that we know harnesses and focuses certain types of waves, crystal radio, etc. And of course, with the cuttlefish, one point I missed is we know that sand has some of these properties. But in your inner ear, you have this tiny little bag, and if it's set in such a way that it usually doesn't get disturbed. But as it tilts and turns, this is what indicates to evidently some part of your brain, your central nervous system, related to balance. And so if this thing goes out of whack, you can have extreme vertigo. I think it's called Meniere's syndrome. That's probably not the correct pronunciation. Meniere's syndrome, where you can have this just violent attack. And the way out of this is a kind of ritual that you have to do if you believe it. You lay on your back and you put one arm over your head, depending on which ear has gone out of whack, and you roll over to that side several times, and then you roll over to the other side several times. And they figured out, they being probably the same guys in the Civil War, because it's one of the few things that, I guess you could go to the doctor for it if you want, and they'll prescribe you some drugs and make sure you got your mask on and you get everything you need as far as jabs and boosters and etc. But you can also just do it at home in your bed and write this tiny bag of crystals, and thereby putting your whole system of equilibrium back into alignment. It's been theorized that that we may have another, well, it might be gone by now, but we have kind of a vestigial, a similar type of crystal-like structure that is buried somewhere kind of back behind the bridge of the nose. And I think that dogs actually still have this fully intact. It's been surmised, though, that maybe this is some type of explanation for the phenomena of the stories where a dog will get left on a vacation in California and the owner's pieces of shit just drive off without him. 3 months later, the dog shows up at the house in Iowa, and there's probably, some case could be made that the dog just smelled the car the whole way. But there are so many instances of these things where these undiscovered, superpowers, which of course is where modern cinema and storytelling that seeks to control and limit and circumscribe your every movement, not, to say nothing of just traumatize you and, as Hoffman says, mind bomb you into a state of perpetual uncertaintism. Usually, this gets wrapped up into some type of cape shit, as we say now. I guess M. Night Shyamalan, if that's how you say his name, he made a fair pass at this, I thought, I didn't see the other two movies, but I saw Unbreakable, which was pretty decent, I thought. And that was quite a while ago. 15 years, 20 years, I don't know. So what if one of these vestigial organs that may or may not still exist within us, because things are changing, somewhat rapidly. Just if you examine the shape of the jaw, the way it fits into the neck, the chin, a lot of this seems to have a lot to do with testosterone levels, but it also seems to have a lot to do with the diet. And as we spoke of in previous episodes, if indeed we're facing a situation, which we are, where the soil has been made jejune, denuded of its nutrients and minerals essential to life, and this is all just kind of, we've known this for quite some time. Just keep going about our business, turn to our macros. Well, what if the macros, they might perform the operation of increasing muscle mass or keeping your body fat in check, and that's fine as long as everything holds together. But what about when things don't hold together and all of a sudden the world, or God, is now demanding of you that you, as the cliche goes, dig deeper? Well, there's this assumption, that whatever you're going to dig deeper for is still there. And where I'm going with this point is, I believe that it is. What all it would be related to, that is just pure speculation. I have I have a couple ideas. I have to admit that it concerns me a great deal that there's the storm again. Hopefully our audio will be okay. It concerns me a great deal that the human body and these tiny little features that we're hardly even aware of. I mean, how many people go through their lives and never know that there's a tiny sack of crystals in each ear cavity? Probably most of them. And how many people go through these comfortable, sedentary, totally anti-heroic lives without ever being pressed, without God providing them with a circumstance where they're called to, quote, dig deeper. I think God makes the call, and I think I gotta say it might be 8 out of 10, it might be 9 out of 10 times. Individual humans seem to be not answering the phone. However, for those of us listening to the Warhorse podcast, producing the Warhorse podcast, this is not us. And as I pondered this question and had several occasions to choose whether to get a pick and a spade, and as Kelly Jo Phelps says, dig down into my mind and see what could be discovered or amplified or otherwise turned up to extricate myself or solve the problem or avoid otherwise certain catastrophe. I have not been let down, and this area, many people, Bap has talked about this, again, Pajot has talked about this with his kind of focus in his podcast and discussion on a re-enchantment of the world. Well, using these sort of ridge lines or fence lines, if you will, of discussion, I'd like to make a stab at getting some propulsion forward from a couple of other guys. And we left off with panentheism in the last episode. Panentheism, again, is this, I believe it's the case. Wikipedia will tell you it's a theory or a school of philosophy or supposition. God in everything. So in the frog's egg example, where you have this we have observed that this is a fact of reality, where certain structures are repeated, are made larger, are reused for in other capacities than where they were first observed. I was recently sent an excellent picture looking up into the branches of a tree on the skyline, which reminded me of the subscribers identifying this precise thing by comparing such a picture to the bronchial branches in the human lung. And in this case, this is exactly what trees do, right? They convert gas into another gas, and it just happens to be these gases that we need to survive. And so, if panentheism is the case, God is in all things. God is creating all things. He is sustaining all things. We are not only dependent on these structures, which are in the Orthodox tradition we call the logoi or the logi, and our reason, our emotional and reasoning capacities, such as they are, would suggest yet another mirroring occurrence. And with respect to trauma, if what we're doing is in healing trauma through breath work, through death work, which again, the quick and dirty, I go to Castaneda, Heidegger has a much expanded explanation, but here I think this is the guy that Castaneda stole it from. The motto that I remember is keep death as your advisor, or death is the only wise advisor that we are afforded. Heidegger goes into a sort of step-by-step discussion or examination of these relationships between, authenticity, which is essentially, in his terms, like examining not being an NPC. Let's say that. I mean, it's pretty much as simple as that. I know the Heidegger devotees who listen to this will be shocked, but that's what we're going with. We're not doing the Vervaeke Petersonian 4 hours to, what do you mean by this? Do you define death as this thing? Like, we don't have time for this shit. So, if death is our only advisor, and we are beings unto death, and we have risen to a place where authenticity is an essential feature of our daily life, and we're using the techniques that we have available to us, in a sense, maybe, we're working almost to be one with the trees. We're working to be one with this world around us. I forget what Heidegger calls that, or no, is it Sartre? The facticity of being. This is the conditions that we find ourselves in. One of these conditions is this maddening, all-pervasive uncertaintism that has only been leveraged and advantaged upon and exacerbated by many decades. In Hoffman's analysis, we're talking about millennia of psychological operations. And as we're piecing together this situation that we're facing, where we have these outside forces, again, we're not, they're diabolical forces. That's just all there is to it. If you want to go this evolutionary route and spend 16 years explaining and building up this house of cards, that's fine. we're still going to arrive back here, where we have this diabolical, dispersive, many forces surrounding us, closing in on us, closing whatever exits might be available, and we're presented in this way that God seems to do with always a ray of hope. And it seems to boil down to our own grit, whether we choose that or not. And where this is hopefully driving this conversation is for us to more closely examine this relationship between the reasoning and emotive or intuitive centers of our brain that are categorically split, dissociated from each other in states of trauma. And one failing of this series, I'll put it in the notes, and maybe that will suffice to provide a salve for our needs here. But there's a TED Talk that I was alerted to a few years ago where, and I have alluded to this, but I haven't been, I don't believe, explicit on it, where a pretty solid case is made, and it's enough for me to run with it, that we are all living in this, condition of PTSD, and this again is BAP's point, this is Kaczynski's point, this is Linkola's point. Many people have made this point from both sides of the quote political spectrum, and it seems to me to be absolutely true, and it seems to me to be one of those pieces for our diminished standing in relation to our ancestors. And so if we are going to square up to this at some point, and we're going to have to proceed with it pretty quick, but once we square up to it, the mechanisms that we, in my opinion, may direct our attention towards involve these deepening, a deeper examination of these attributes that we're just leaving on the table. Because you get into meditation and you get into yoga and you get into self-care or self-improvement, and you got your glycine, you're sunning your balls, you've worked out your relationships, you found meaningful work even. Now granted, all this is, probably not on the immediate horizon for all of us. But I'm speaking of in terms of our goals, and there are some of us that'll probably skate through the next 3 to 10 years and take not a scratch, but we'll see. However, we have the duty to pass something more than drudgery and this depressing landscape of failure onto our children. We also have the task of, and one of the most concerning features of this time is how many people finally get clued into one angle or another of this spiraling set of problems and quote obstacles for the corporate types among us. These are obstacles to be conquered, evidently. And well, if we're going to conquer them, we're going to need more than fucking platitudes. We're going to need more than scientism. We're going to need more than the blue church, as Vanderklay terms it. This sort of just watered down, probably genetic, instinct towards religious experience that's been co-opted entirely by the liberal establishment and just utterly contorted and perverted and plugged back in the form of medical tyranny. That's all going to have to be addressed. But also, the side that I sort of find myself on is, in truth, almost every way just as fucked up. I mean, to take a quick journey back to 9/11, we did mention this before, but it's worth mentioning again. The notion identified by many historians of great renown that eventually empire abroad becomes tyranny at home. This shit was well known. And for anybody paying attention, the threat of terrorism coming to our shores was itself very distorted, right? Just we have another psychological operation, and the people that fell for that are honestly in no better shape. I mean, that obesity that we're talking about, that doesn't exist to nearly the same degree up and down the West Coast as it does in the South. It's not even close. I mean, the South is holding up the we can mix some metaphors there, but there's way more fat people in the South than there are in Los Angeles, San Francisco, Seattle. So, is it that the narcissism is higher there? Yeah, for sure. That's a part of it. I mean, have no doubt. The character of the people, in my estimation, I would trust probably more people in most areas of the South than I would in most areas of San Francisco, Portland, Seattle, etc. Especially with, anything, we're just a question of character. Yeah. So, to tie that up and to be very clear, I see a situation in the near term where we come out of this, but we're coming out, by this I mean this sort of dynamic where I would say the liberal communist sort of side of this whole two-sided operation, this ongoing dialectic, seems to be poised to drop a hammer of some sort. And we've long known that the Republicans, their real job is to just roll over next year and go along with whatever they were fighting last year and then turn that against you. So if it was gay marriage, we're against this, fast forward a year. Okay, if you don't go with gay marriage, then you're out of the Republican Party. You clearly, this is the point. The point is not that this is not obvious. The point is that it has taken this fucking long for a substantial portion of those that vote red to wake up to it. And so my question is not to blame them, it's not any of that. It's not to point the finger. It's to question if the situation is actually such that we're going to have to tune more inward, as opposed to just return to this, well, the economy's good, so I'm good. Well, mama's happy, so I'm happy. This ridiculous, absurd dog shit that stands in for traditional wisdom has got to die. It has got to get the fuck out of the way to make room for actual wisdom. And you guys can see that if we were able to meld these two, if you were able to take Rupert Sheldrake and his, career-spanning investigation, totally scientific investigations into ESP and related phenomena, supernatural sort of stuff, and you could somehow meld him with Pat Buchanan or something, you might. Well, I mean, I would bet money that we would arrive at a better situation, even if it wasn't perfect, than what we have now in terms of anything resembling sanity. So, try and veer myself back out of this political cesspool that I am currently wallowing in, and bring this back to David Lynch. So in David Lynch we have, I've said it before, what I think of as one of the very few legitimate artistic geniuses of the modern era who was also allowed to operate in the mainstream. And the reasons for that are somewhat unknown. We could speculate on it. He comes from the Northwest. I understand he spent most of his childhood in Idaho, good portions exploring Oregon, Washington, Montana, etc. Goes off to art school in Philadelphia, I think. His dad was evidently a big influence on him. He was, I believe, a sort of park ranger again, going back to last week's conversation. A man who very much loved trees is what David Lynch has described him as. And listening to, reading his biographies and the books that he's written, listening to several and reading several, he's very familiar to me. He feels like somebody from my culture, from the Northwest. These people that were sort of displaced out of the South and the Mid-Atlantic, or coming west, and in waves, and living during some good times for sure. Some of the best living in America, or probably all of human history, it would seem to me, was on the West Coast as it was being built up. If you've ever looked at pictures of Los Angeles before it was spoiled, phenomenal. Most of the Oregon coast is still, it's somewhat polluted like everything, but nothing like what you have in California, nothing like even what you have in Washington. But this is the unspoiled. We still had old growth trees in this area where David Lynch comes in, and if we fast forward, we have a pretty phenomenal career, all the way leading up to my point here in bringing it up to season 3 of Twin Peaks. And we've mentioned in essays and discussions this episode 8 that I remember watching when it first aired, and then going online, and the response was like just giant question marks. Other people were, like myself, were like, that was a masterpiece. Of course, I had the benefit of having a pretty good idea of what was going on. But most people, I think, even those types of Variety and these types of magazines who comment on these things, were flabbergasted. And the reason that I had some inkling of what was going on was because I'd read Michael Hoffman's book, Secret Societies and Psychological Warfare. I keep saying operations, but it's warfare. So, how did David Lynch, who spends a lot of time, as an adult in Los Angeles, that's where he lives now, and he's made movies for 40 or 50 years. I'm sure he's traveled everywhere. I'm sure he's went back, and he might be one of these guys who has a sweet little cabin tucked away on the border of Idaho and Washington that he doesn't tell anybody about. But he's definitely a made man. Eraserhead, I believe, was his first major film, and that got Academy Award attention, which then he, I don't know that he was super thrilled about it. He says that Dune is kind of he won't talk about it, it's his only regret. I think that they sort of threw him under the bus, and it was probably somewhat of a doomed project. But still, I will go back and I will watch Dune. I've seen the other iterations of Dune, and I think one of the others is really good, but I still think that Lynch's is a classic. And whether or not he did Frank Herbert justice or whatever, that's another discussion. But from there, it seemed like whatever backlash he took for it maybe being a box office failure, etc., kind of re-grounded him in a good way and forced him to move on. He makes Blue Velvet, which is then like a instant cult classic. The Hollywood trilogy of what is it? Lost Highway, Mulholland Drive, and I'm gonna forget the other one. He also makes Wild at Heart before, Twin Peaks, of course. And he made a couple of others. The Straight Story is the one that sort of... we probably don't, want to go into a total discussion of the Lynch discography, as it were, but The Straight Story is worth seeing because it's kind of like Lynch going against Lynch in a way, and Richard Farnsworth is always worth watching. But here's a guy who gets to make these sort of obscure movies over a long period of time. Meanwhile, you have Michael Hoffman living up there in, again, in Idaho. Coeur d'Alene, I believe. Very quiet guy, reclusive. I have dug down into Mr. Hoffman's history. I found those thrift store books. I turned up some old Hoffman stuff that I don't know if he's ever talked about it. novel he wrote. He's put out this newsletter for, I don't know, 20 years or something. And there's a period of Michael Hoffman's career, I believe it's after he gets out of the Associated Press, and is, feeding his family, doing whatever it is that he does up there in Idaho. He's also simultaneously working on his study of conspiracy culture as a culture, a phenomena, in America, but also through the inside by studying various conspiracies. And he hooks up with this guy named Shelby Downard. And Mr. Downard had written a piece that ends up being called King Kill 33. And I'm not sure entirely. I believe that Hoffman was working with Adam Parfrey and Grimstead on this type of these projects. I think a couple of books and magazine looking at conspiracy culture. So they had they could retreat to irony if they wanted. They could refer to it, not that Hoffman did this, but I think Parfrey did. But they could legitimize it in a type of as a novelty. While also picking up some of the genuine conspiracy theorists along the way and selling books to them. And I think through these guys he meets Downard, and he probably runs into the real thing, maybe for the first time. And Downard has put forward a pretty original idea called mystical toponymy. And he essentially identifies a series of what would otherwise be known as schizophrenic connections, coincidences, in relation to places. And one of the main ones, King Kill 33 is mostly about JFK and the, quote, killing of the king. The wicked King Wicker. And maybe to make the point, in Hoffman and Downard's terms, simply by saying those words, the wicked King Wicker, we as listeners are propelled back into a kind of generational or ancestral memory, where at another time our ancestors understood that if the powers that be in front of us have erected this giant wicker man and installed a human sacrifice inside of it, and then they torched the whole thing, this is a type of threat. Our ancestors who may have been illiterate and not had a lot of time to study the internet, to look up symbolism and whatnot, this was 100% clear to them. Whereas now, after being subjected to what Hoffman calls the videodrome, this, electronic, constant invasion, this surgical invasion of our minds to lobotomize us almost, we don't have this capacity. We're lacking entirely these basic facilities that we had prior. And I'm not necessarily drawing a direct link between this earlier point about this question of what have we lost. What vestigial organs do we still have and are not aware of, but might need to dig into and activate again, activate our almonds. I'm not directly making that point, but I guess it's there. Hoffman is saying something more along the lines of like a not Jungian archetype necessarily, but his point is that symbolism and the pageantry, the little statements behind operations are where you find the telltale keys. So in some of this mystical toponymy that Hoffman and Downer did together, they noticed that there were some peculiarities, or more directly stated, some of these kind of winks, nods, tells in the original testing of the atom bomb in the land of enchantment of New Mexico, on the Trinity site, on the Jornada del Muerto, which is apparently an old road that came up from Mexico heading to Santa Fe. And of course, in Spanish, this means the journey of death. And there's no way I can do all of this justice. It simply has to be read. You've got to get this book. I would get both of his books immediately, post haste. And I've read the first one probably 8 or 10 times. I think I've said this before. And Twilight Language is in its way just as good. And as we mentioned as well, Hoffman and Lynch share this quality of having put out a piece of work, kind of promised that we'll pick up on it in 20 or so years, and then fulfilled the promise in spades. So that's a curious thing. And Hoffman suggests that essentially what is being, he makes the case. I think it's a pretty damn good case that the folks behind these tests, they did some pretty weird stuff. There's talk of some sort of vessel that was planted at the first site, and it's never really discussed, in the mainstream literature, and it was removed, I think, in subsequent tests. But there was some insinuation that maybe this thing was filled with something. And Hoffman makes the case that it's essentially a homunculus, some tiny little mannequin that in Talmudic or ancient Masonic Egyptian lore is like Frankenstein. Perhaps some attempt to bring this thing to life was made. And the just endless examples of this odd shit that happens surrounding many of these major operations is undeniable. You can chalk it up to, well, people are crazy and people are nutty, but then there's this consistency over time that you have to account for. A consistency over generations of intent, direction of these, and sort of coherence, if you will, between them, where they're all kind of seem to be leading to a similar place with the same theme of, aren't we so clever and these plebes are so dumb, and look what they do. And of course the problem is that as the operations became more effective and as steam was gathered, they got a hold of this technology of trauma. And so this loop has been widened, and weird ellipses have been made in it, and it's all a jumbled mess. And so the few of us that have been forced through some circumstance or another to go inward to start looking at this stuff, you eventually recoil, and then hopefully you get pissed off. So in the Twin Peaks episode 8, there's not, again, you have to see it. We can't spend 2 hours just detailing it. But of course, what happens, just as a quick refresher, is we have this atomic test, and Lynch shows this sort of like insect demonic entity that enters the fabric of reality and begins to cause some serious dark mayhem right away. And within the context of the story, this is flashing back to what becomes the Blue Rose FBI investigation that ultimately Dale Cooper, Kyle MacLachlan character, is investigating in the Twin Peaks series. And some, cognizance of this stuff is indicated by the character of Major Garland Briggs, who is an Air Force officer who also works on these Blue Rose cases and is deeply aware of some type of supernatural entity existence. He doesn't necessarily ever explain what it is, but we find out that that's part of his job too, and that's why he's in Twin Peaks. As far as I know, David Lynch has never talked to Michael Hoffman. As far as I know, the other guy involved in Twin Peaks, Frost, is, from what I can tell on Twitter, not particularly clued into any of this stuff. Maybe there are other sources they've used. However, Lynch has evidenced the type of integrity over a long period of time that I'll try and go into next through some examples that suggests to me that none of that explains it. We have the interviews, of course, the famous memes where the interviewer asks, do you believe in demons, David Lynch? Yes, I do. Would you care to elaborate on that? No. Maybe that's not the exact meme, but it's close enough. So I think, Frost is the other guy's name. Definitely not the guy. According to David Lynch, what he does is transcendental meditation. You got to take some classes to get into this. I've never been particularly drawn to it. He's been a devotee for like 30 or 40 years, and whether or not that has some bearing on it particularly, I doubt it. The meditation part probably definitely has some major bearing on it. And in his book about making art, he states that he meditates and he fishes for big ideas. Whether that works out like he casts his line and then he comes out of a session of meditation with some fully fledged idea is probably not the case. It may be to some degree. I bet small pieces do. They fill in the blanks of bigger things. My guess is he's an example of some type of pretty stable relationship between the gut biome, the control of his routine. He's notoriously routinized. He eats at the same place. He'll what I've suggested in the latest essays is build routines, examine them, and then break them, and maybe continue them for years or maybe just several months. But from what I've read and seen, that's exactly what he does. There's a famous story of him going to this Bob's Big Boy in Los Angeles, even after he was famous, sitting down in one of these booths and having a strawberry milkshake, I believe. And I think he's right. Somebody asked him about this, and he said, well, if you do the same thing, if you build up this routine and you're in the same place every day, well then, the spirits basically know where to find you. Well, not to make too direct a connection between, holy orthodoxy and this, but to draw the eye towards the act, the fact of ritual here is the point. And I think the best among us, this is what we're trying to do in a completely chaotic and fucked up situation. Even now, this is what I'm trying to do. Not that I'm necessarily one of the best of us, but that's why I say trying, I've definitely found this to be true. When I control what I eat and control where I am and control what I do and can plan on that happening tomorrow and then fulfill that obligation to myself, perhaps this is, again, just explained in these scientism type of terms where, I'm building integrity with my inner child or something. This is the type of language that I am advocating we abandon, jettison immediately. And we move towards, you can see just by this discussion, I'm not necessarily advocating that you spend 6 years trying to understand Heidegger, who scholars spend their entire lives, and I don't think they come to some great agreement about it. I'm suggesting rather that we get what we need, and we know we need ritual. Here I am, once again with you, staring at my notebook, staring at my West German SIG, and my Winkler operator. In this case, there's some differences. The dogs, the storm, etc. And maybe this will change. This is just the early stages of this project. And of course, you do run up into these exigencies, emergencies, contingencies that you need to face in order to get anything done. But to the extent that you can build out some type of structure for yourself, my suggestion would be that this is a good thing. And this is one of the meanings behind the phrase, made in the image of God. In some near useless, weak piss in comparison to God manner, I think that we're building our own, maybe rather the language might be that we are discovering, our little versions of logi or logoi, these structures that we can inhabit and we can invest ourselves in, sacrifice our time, sacrifice opportunities, and then come through tomorrow on doing what we promised ourselves we would do. And over time, this bears fruit. In the same way that breathwork takes time, but ultimately can open up all of these doors, all doors, like you could call it one big door that can go anywhere you want. And of course, deathwork in the same way, opening up this relationship with the facticity, as Heidegger says, of your circumstances changes everything. Changes the urgency, the immediacy, and it might not necessarily be what you think. It might not be, well, I just got to rush around and get all this shit done because you never know when I'm going to die. It might rather be that you need to simplify a whole bunch of stuff, slow way the fuck down, and focus on one thing, doing it to the absolute best of your ability. And as Jordan Peterson suggests, see what happens with that. I'm not prescribing one thing or another in this particularly. So to examine Lynch a little bit more, I was rewatching the first few episodes of season 3, and he's always credited as an editor. Forgive me, I don't want to break up the stream, so I'm just going to wet my whistle. And so in these first couple episodes, you can't help but notice a couple of things that I'll try and touch on just from memory. So you have basically Bad Cooper, who is kind of the demon Bob has sort of entered this version of Cooper, and the doppelganger Good Cooper has been locked up in the Black Lodge for 25 years. And he's released on this time scale, I guess, and Bad Cooper, probably very acquainted with the ways of the lodge, is aware of the time frame and has set up a situation where he's made a tulpa, a sort of NPC, version of Cooper that inhabits whatever this sort of meat suit. The whole ontic picture is not entirely clear. It is clear. I mean, it's perfectly clear, but at the same time, it's like I don't know that what terms exactly Lynch is subscribing to, but you have the two Coopers in different worlds in this limbo state in the Black Lodge, and then he is exiled out into non-existence, and he's picked up by this very curious character who seems to be stationed, in nowhere, and he is received by her in some way, and in the process of getting back to the quote world, he passes through this an outlet, basically a series of this giant outlet in space, and then he emerges through an outlet in a house in Las Vegas. And you immediately start to see echoes of worlds being mirrored. There is a sign in this Las Vegas town, Rancho Rio or something, but it's got the double R from the Double R Cafe. And that's real obvious. And you have some other kind of, I call them handholds or handrails, where the creator is really trying to help the audience, pick up on some of this stuff, which was something I've had cause to work with, and editors and such have helped me do this. I have to say, I admitted this to my wife, that some of the stuff, even though I'm aware of it as the creator, I still miss it as the observer, the listener. So I'm not denigrating anybody who missed it. But it's where the art comes in for me is in these examples. I think it's episode 3 or 4. It's maybe 3 and 4. He's using these different color palettes and he's placing them on these female characters, and they're basically wearing the classic red drapes or curtains that are in the Black Lodge. It's a similar fabric, and it shows up, I think, on 3 different women. And in some sense, this is an archetype, Jungian or not. It's certainly a literary device going back way, to who knows how long. To me, it reminds of that Leonard Cohen song, "The Sisters of Mercy." And women are often depicted as having a role in this portal situation. And of course too, if you study those first few episodes, when the action of a portal happens, there seems to coincide with some sex. And sex is definitely, I'm not prepared to, we don't have the time, and it would be kind of outside of the scope of this, but we can definitely touch on this, and we should. Because one of the things that I think in some ways is polluting the discussion about men being men and the reemergence of warrior cults, which, make no mistake, that is of a great and serious importance to me, and that is one of the major themes of this here podcast. So we should probably set it on the back burner for now, and return to just this literary observation that oftentimes accompanying arrivals, departures, journeys, and to say nothing of like sanctuaries and help, when you need it most. Oftentimes this is pictured, and this goes back to the Theotokos, Mother Mary, and this type of imagery. In the Lynchian case here, and again, if you guys study these or just, check these episodes out and watch these women. There's one woman who's like a drug addict who's holed up in this house across from Dougie's rental or whatever. He's entertaining this hooker whore at this house, and across the way is this junkie. She's definitely wearing this color. And then that color is echoed in a couple other instances. You have this yellow Jeep color merging between scenes seamlessly, right around that same time frame. And what he's doing is essentially stitching together for your subconscious mind, using the language of art, an expression of something that's maybe not entirely totally scientifically in Heideggerian terms, worked out, such that, well, can I buy it and reproduce it? Well, probably not, buddy. What you probably have to do is put in as much work as David Lynch did. Because one thing about this guy, he may be considered an odd dude, but I have great admiration for this guy, and he's done nothing but produce work his entire career, whether it was furniture or paintings or albums or books or photographs or films that will if society is here 200 years from now, one or two of these movies will still be here, I think. And so it's for this reason of David Lynch's devotion to his art and the integrity evidenced in these fine details, to say nothing of, well, there's some substance here. Now, whether it's worked out to perfection and a perfect expression of, how portals work is kind of beside the point. I don't necessarily have a point other than to draw attention to this relationship between a man who I think has integrity in David Lynch and another man who I think has integrity in Michael Hoffman, who are both of them at way different ends of the social proof scale. Nothing against Michael Hoffman. I mean, if you write some of the shit that he's written, no, you're not. You're going to be blackballed, and the ADL is going to throw hate at you, and etc. So, what exactly is going on there? I do not think in any way that these guys are in cahoots. I don't think that Lynch is doing any type of watering down of the Hoffman narrative or anything like this. I think most of this has just slipped under the radar, and I'd be curious to know how much of it, what does Michael Hoffman think about it? Because there might be some access to him. I have not yet attempted to contact him regarding an interview, and unless the Patreon subscribers subscription numbers really rocket up, David Lynch is probably not accessible. But maybe, I probably shouldn't be negative at all. I mean, I don't know. I would kill a lot of people, certain people, under the right circumstances, in order to hang out with David Lynch. I'm joking, of course. If handlers have been assigned at this point, I'm just kidding. So, to tie these together in this this segment, I think I want to go back to Heidegger. And we left off in the last episode with his concept of what I think is called, or pronounced, Sorge. And in these, Heidegger had a way of creating his own shorthand, which makes sense. For if you're doing the kind of work that he's doing, it just makes sense to me. But as far as I can understand it, Sorge essentially means a kind of care. And it seems to me that he means this in the sense of he does give examples of exactly what he means. And I believe that he means the kind of care that you would extend into something like a lifelong devotion to an art project, as well as a kind of care that you would extend to a friend or family member, in dire straits. Kind of constancy, a devotion. And Heidegger says that this can really only arrive in the state of authenticity. So NPCs aren't really given to this, which makes sense. And through authenticity, you're opened up to, whether I have the sequencing right or wrong, it's probably important to Heidegger, but I don't really care. At some point in this process, if you read the essay on deathwork, I give an example of this. You need to be cracked open like an egg, and to the reality of your mortality. And I believe that extending this sort of this sorge into your own situation may be the positive way to twist back the kind of attention that's like hyper focused on the self and a lot of the self-help literature and podcasts and everything else, where if you talk to some of these people who are super deep into it, once you stop talking about their particular psychodrama that they're entertaining right now, like they don't have anything to talk about other than that. And it's like I said earlier, I think that a lot of what you're doing when you are smoothing out the trauma loop and unraveling this relationship between your emotional centers, your intuitive centers, and your pure reasoning logic centers, a lot of what's really happening here is you're sorting out fine pieces from other fine pieces, because as that expression goes, the best lies are, 9 parts truth and 1 part bullshit. And you sneak the medicine in with the sugar, so to speak. So with Sorge applied to what I hope is becoming clear in a relationship of behaviors that are available to you to adopt, these being mainly a recognition of the uncertaintism pervading our times, and that includes a sort of ongoing analysis of it, which is, I would refer to, that's the Hoffman piece. Hoffman in his language allows for, a certain ambiguity. You might be wrong about this detail or that, but the trajectory, again, is going north. We're not talking about something that's going south. It's definitely bad. It is not good. This is the effect of psychological operations. These are the operations, and there you go. Deathwork here related to Sorge, what I'm trying to kind of put in place, hopefully for you guys, is a certain kind of care for your own time remaining. What do you really want to do with it? I mean, personally speaking, on this level, there's a lot that I want to do for my children. There's a lot I want to do for my wife and some other family members. There are a few big pieces of, creative output that I want to invest my time in. One of the main things that's never going to be expressed other than, insinuated or suggested at this point or that in this novel or that book, but hopefully very clearly in these podcasts, is in the same way that breathwork seems to mirror this frog eggs conversation, this mirroring of the inner and outward. The breathwork itself seems to, insofar as you can take it on, seems to mirror this relationship with God. It's said that God accounts for every hair. Every hair is numbered just as every grain of sand. That's not biblical, that's Bob Dylan, but I think he stole that from the Bible. But you see the point. There's this absolute intimacy implied in everything that is implied through panentheism. That if this is the state, that God, this unfathomable being, is in my cig and in my winkler and in my dogs, as well as in my child, as well as in the trees and the grass and the sand and space and empty space and all of being itself, the totality of existence. If every hair is numbered, every breath is numbered. And the more the science comes out that suggests breathing through your mouth is not bueno, and it's in direct relationship with all of these maladaptive, dysfunctional, eventually turning to conditions, diseases, ongoing. And this is the type of relationship that's available to us to create just simply through breath. Okay? So what is available to us in terms of ritual and our relationship to death through ritual? And in having the very unfortunate funereal experience recently, I can tell you that if the modern kind of standard American, no offense to Protestants, but generally Protestant funeral is not a psychological operation, if it is, I'm not in the least surprised. And if it is not, then it is absolutely working right in his hand in glove as a result of all of these psychological operations. And I would include this in Hoffman's terms going back millennia to where tribes are dispersed, the sort of corporate homogeneity begins, the consolidation, and differences, true diversity is erased from the earth. And so we have again this phenomenon of lies regarding one thing mirroring a truth in another, and then both of these extant on the interior and the exterior. So much has been done about the exterior, and in this, I think you're picking up what I'm putting down in this regard. I mean, many conversations have opened up many eyes, I would say, since 2016, 2014, regarding, what would be true diversity. How it escapes everybody that the hippies of permaculture proved long ago that, true strength and diversity still requires that each plant have, its space, and that a monoculture does not yield strong, nutritious fruit. It just degrades and degrades and degrades, and it has to be filled with, pumped full of this chemical or that chemical, which sucks another resource off of the planet. So we start to see, I hope, a picture that is actually cohesive in its mechanisms of destruction. It's I guess you could maybe sum it up to say, the trauma loop is definitely on the external now too, and it's collectivized. It's being made uniform, and as we are being attempted to be made fully into cattle and have our humanity completely extinguished or diminished in some transhumanist nightmare, dystopian hellscape, I think that the Heideggerian idea of Sorge can be extended into a practice of ritualized death work, and thereby you will find interior portals. This may be what Ernst Junger, was suggesting in the forest passage. It seems to me that the forest passage was a metaphor for something internal. And while I found his book quite good and, moving in its way, I think that I would like to talk to him when we all cross over to the other side. If there's an opportunity to sit down and tell him what my take on it would be, not to besmirch the man's anything about him. Far more man than I could ever hope to be. However, I would trifle on this point where if we examine panentheism and we start to see that at some level, the inner and the outer, these distinctions are likely made for our survival. It's probably not the capital R essential reality. I don't think that God requires that. I don't think that a true conception of a totally omniscient being, would require anything like that. I think this whole creation is just like the Bible says, made for us. For what we don't know. I believe that these self-help folks are onto something. Again, the fine threads needing to be parsed out of the fine threads, not a real strength of the remnant red church. Fuck that, get her done. Well, yeah, there's absolutely a time for fuck that and get her done. 100%, trust me. There's also a time where, you're not going to make the Sistine Chapel by getting her done. You're not going to make, as McCarthy says towards the end of No Country for Old Men, in that conversation between the sheriff, I believe, and his uncle, a great uncle, why did this man sit down and carve into the bedrock a water trough out of solid stone to last 10,000 years? Why did he do that? It's no accident that the sheriff, who finds himself unable to face, by his own admission, the tide in front of him, it's no accident that that man is a Texan. It's no accident that that man's a sheriff. It's no accident that he doesn't have a great insight into the blue hair and the bones in their nose and yes sir, no ma'am. He's befuddled. He is awash in uncertaintism, and he knows that he is outclassed. And he is also likewise befuddled by the actions of this unknown person, this artist, who would sit down and devote his life to this project, or hours of, presumably work all day, come home and chip away at this thing in the evenings before crashing out. Why would he do this? He knows there's something there. Sheriff Bell knows. There's some mystery encased in this memory that is seared into his mind that comes up in this, moving, emotional sort of conversation with his uncle. And the folks who find themselves, with the knife to their throat right now, flyover folks, southern folks, I think this is the lesson. This is hopefully, I have maybe a foot in both camps, or maybe, honestly, I don't think I have a foot in either anymore. That's just the honest fact. And my history, would suggest that I hope has plenty of experience in both camps. but I have taken this forced passage, I suppose, quite a while before I ever read that book. And the way that is done, the way that this portal that I believe is this made of this third substance, neither material nor non-material, but some yet undefined admixture of the two and probably some other thing. This is the state of things, you know. Death is not the end, then what is it? It's not this absurd notion of a man floating in the sky with a beard and some pearly fucking gates and you're going to stand there and have an account. Again, Earth itself is more complicated than that. More nuanced, more magical, more, as Peugeot says, already much more enchanted. I do not believe that this is the type of experience we are headed towards. And I think that some of the depression and some of the anxiety can be alleviated by exploring these ideas. And if you can apply this constancy that Heidegger speaks of, this kind of care, okay, with a capital C, great care. And yeah, that extends to, you know, brute force at times. That extends to absolute precision, it seems almost all of the time, however. And this is this distinction that seems to be lacking. And there's much discussion, and we can go into the history of why, and, you know, the warriors were separated from the scholars, and the, one of my favorites that I, having Southern roots myself, I do not feel like, you know, I'm shitting on anybody's dinner plate here. I found it very interesting, the reports regarding debates between the Yankees and the Southerners, how it appears that the Southerners would just walk all over the Yankees. That until, you know, certain members of various tribes were integrated into the fabric of things, that the folks coming from whatever this coalition of the unwilling, you know, unwilling to do the work, unwilling to find care, unwilling to sacrifice, this ongoing sort of mixed up mutt group that has power now, you know, when these people confronted the Southern legal man, I mean, they were put in their place. And so there's precedent for this, and yet there's not, because I'm attempting to speak on this earlier. There are some leaps that need to be made in terms of call it cultural appropriation or whatever. I mean, stuff like breathwork or deathwork, in whatever form you choose to take it, needs to be given in this sort of topical level to the rituals that we still have lingering around, that are no rituals at all. They're just empty, depressing. There's this great movie called Big Bad Love. And the main character's kid passes, and he goes to the funeral, and he's having this reverie hallucination, and the preacher says, "And a greater walk with thee, blah, blah." and dust unto dust, blah, blah. And Arliss Howard, I think, made this movie. And again, you know, he's not a guy. Here's a guy. That movie didn't get very far, you know. I wonder why. But I mean, this is another guy who's doing essentially the work I am hoping to do, just in this very explicit end of pilot episode 5 here. It's a dishonor. And so when we speak about, you know, our people, Americans, being degraded, we can talk about all sorts of statistics and policy recommendations, and we can do this and fucking argue about it forever. Or you and I can just seize now back the things that are available to us. You know, the breath is available right now, wherever you are. Your ability to apply precise, a charged kind of care, precision, and force towards your interior, the interiority of yourself, you know, namely this relationship between your traumatized two sides of the brain, and then fold that out into the people around you, and hopefully create portals that are, again, a third substance, which changes all substance, you know, which changes the material conditions you find yourself in, as well as, for lack of any other word, you know, the mystical conditions that hopefully you find yourself in quiet, contemplative moments of solitude. And we know that the manosphere advocates solitude. I'm just curious, you know, can you put down the whiskey after the first drink to loosen up? Can you actually hold a consistent, even query? You know, you don't have to have a narrative. We're going on to hour and 51 minutes in one take, and I'm not bragging or trying. Believe me, this isn't exactly the easiest thing for me to do. I'm not, you know, 100% gifted with this. If there's coherence to be had here, it's through many, many, many years of what I believe is sorge. There's a etymological discussion, you know, regarding this word, and I cannot recall all the particulars, but it is suggested that the S-O of S-O-R-G-E, the S-O-R, you know, relates to sorrow. And this is maybe the place to close off. In my experience, having gone to some great lengths to mend these two areas of my interior being, myself, I believe that this is one of these signposts. You know, the greater men than I have walked this road, and they seem to have left suggestions that there is an infinite kind of sorrow that cannot be ultimately assuaged, and should not be buried in avoidance behaviors, or, you know, made many levels worse through these exacerbated dysfunctional breathing patterns. And it should not just be denied by there's plenty of false churches And I, I'm not saying orthodoxy is perfect. There's plenty of issues with it. So don't misunderstand on that silly point. There are plenty of false, let's say preachers, pastors, etc., certainly gurus who, preach some type of infinite bliss. And even in bliss, and maybe most of all in some, paradoxical sense, bliss carries with it the knowing of sorrow. You can't have bliss without sorrow. And so if you are experiencing bliss, it's just flip the mirror around and there it is. And you guys can pick up that, I'm not advocating for you to not be happy, for you to not have massive, abundant joy in your life. What I'm doing is hopefully laying out or leaving on the side of this trail a little marker or a note that indicates that if you experience something that may be described as an ocean of sorrow, and you have cause to despair, because what other than an ocean of sorrow might lead to the poisoned estuary of despair. If you notice this yourself, I think you're on the right road. And I think that through deathwork specifically, which we're going to go more into all of this stuff. This isn't the end. This is me trying under some pretty tough circumstances to tie this up in a quasi-commercial product that I still feel good about. The portals are somewhere on the other side of that sense. And if you need to understand, what happened to us, there are plenty of books, but there are none that sum it up in quite the way that leads to an understanding of why trauma is the operant mechanism for the technocratic cabal of controllers that we face, the New World Order. Then there's nothing better than Michael Hoffman's work. So I mentioned McCarthy, and I've mentioned Lynch. I've mentioned Kelly Jo Phelps. I've mentioned several people who I would offer up as people who, again, in McCarthy's terms, carved or devoted their lives to carving what may have just been an old, forgotten water trough that nobody cares about, or might have been something much, much grander than that. But the key was the devotion, and the key was in finding a way to put the sorrow, to use the ocean as fuel into this Tan Chen concept. And I don't think that I'm steering you guys wrong in this, and I hope that I'm not, repeating stuff that if you already know it, then hell, send me some feedback and talk about the next steps on this road. But I don't think that we've made it as a species a hell of a lot farther. I think that we're down once again to a place where we're gonna figure out some things. Those of us that can put together these pieces, create, manufacture, or discover these inner portals for us, leading to other realms, other worlds, far beyond what seems possible now. And even if that's like I said earlier, just this interior sort of hope. Well, fuck, that's not so bad. I don't think that's what it is. I think that's the big mystery, and that's the big potential of humanity. That's the key to this image of God. And, this is contained, as best my very limited, admitted understanding of the mystery of Christ and the resurrection is also tied right up into all of this discussion. The care, the focus, the sacrifice, the portal, the forces arrayed against us. So until next time, take care.